Hello. I feel a little bit awkward on camera, but it's fine. My name's Kendra, and this is my little get ready with me for work while I talk to you about why the final girl trope is a little bit sexist. Thank you. So, I personally love horror movies. They're like one of my favorite things in the world. I've been watching them since I was a kid. It got to the point that my dad was trying to like show me the scariest ones he's ever seen, and I just ended up falling in love with them, and they were my favorite thing ever. And they still are. I spend a lot of time watching movies. I'm talking almost all of my free time, given I don't have much, is used to watch movies and go into that whole other, I guess, genre of things. So, with the term final girl, I'll start with explaining that a little bit, and giving you, like, the history of it. So, I have my notes behind you just because I want to make sure that they're right. But the final girl trope was first coined by film professor Carol J. Clover in 1992, but the concept has become well established in horror films much earlier than that. The defining traits of a final girl are her innocence, virginity, and lack of a male savior, which makes her survival all the more heroic. There is a debate on whether the final girl represents a feminist figure or a victim defined by her gender and sexuality. Over time, the final girl has evolved into more complex and self-aware characters. Some examples being Maxine in X, Sidney Prescott in the Scream franchise, all of those. So, with the final girl, she's usually the last one standing. Maybe I should actually start, like, getting ready. She's usually the last one standing, and they often have traits like innocence and resilience, and typically, with a final girl, you would see her she's not a victim, but she has reason to be one if she were. So some examples of the final girl that are like super famous: Laurie Strode from the Halloween franchise. There's so many movies. Oh my god. Sidney Prescott from Scream, like I mentioned. Both of these characters endure like super unimaginable things, but still emerge like victorious from their male counterparts and their antagonists. But the thing is with final girls is a lot of them have to sacrifice traditional feminine traits to survive. They adopt more masculine characteristics in the process, which I feel like is what makes me raise the question of how are these women being portrayed in horror films. And this is not just something that I believe, this is something that I think many people in different communities, more specifically the horror community, have argued about. You're my mirror, by the way. Because what I have here is like critics argues that this trope reinforces outdated and harmful stereotypes, suggesting that women must conform to male ideas of strength to be considered strong. More often than not, the journey of the final girl is set against a backdrop that views women primarily as victims, limiting our understanding of female agency within these narratives. I'm just going to use the same examples that I did previously. So while Laurie and Sydney's characters can be interpreted as symbols of empowerment, their victories in these films often come at a cost of denying aspects of their femininity. I feel like this sends a troubling message to young girls who are watching these films, making them think that femininity is inherently weak, that they can't survive if they're feminine, which is completely inaccurate. But I do think that there's a growing change for this in films. If horror movies could move beyond the final girl trope, and challenge more traditional gender role expectations, I think it would provide a better grasp of the female experience, and I think it would resonate a lot more with female audiences, because typically I think horror movies are also seen as something that is primarily male consumed. I mean, you see these films like Scream and Halloween where some of these characters are so inherently sexualized that it just makes you think, okay, so this was written for a man. Yeah, recent films have begun to take steps in this direction. Some that I'm gonna list are like some of my favorites. The Invisible Man, we see a female protagonist whose strength not just lies in her survival, but in her emotional and psychological journey. And then I also think that there's like a pretty good correlation of like the invisible struggles that women face. And then something else is, this is two of my favorite films ever, and that is You're Next and Ready or Not. Similarly, characters like Erin in You're Next and Grace in Ready or Not subvert the final girl trope by embodying resourcefulness and cunning without sacrificing their femininity. They navigate their terrifying situations with intelligence and agency, proving that strength can take many forms. And this brings up another point that I want to kind of get across, and is that in Ready or Not, Grace, in my opinion, is not sexualized. And I think even though that the actress, I forgot her name, is a gorgeous, gorgeous girl, she's not sexualized. And I think that that's something that I really loved about the film, was that if she was like using her sexuality, it was for her gain and her gain only. I mean, she's against her brand new husband's whole family and him trying to survive in this crazy mansion. And I think that that's so important to mention, is that even with things that are not typically thought of when you're first watching a movie, even her costume design, I mean, her dress in the beginning is fully covered, long sleeves, very, very beautiful, very lacy, very bride-like, because it was a wedding dress. But then as you go through the film, she uses some of what she has on as like bandages and things like that. And I think that's one of the cases where she may not look like this beautiful, delicate bride anymore, but she still has that femininity with her. She's still wearing this dress, even despite her having the option to go change if she really wanted to, and into something like pants or whatever. And then Erin in You're Next. I really love this film because in You're Next, she's at, again, her boyfriend's house. I'm sensing a theme here. And with that, even though she is, against these intruders and everything, it's not one of those stories where you're wondering how are they able to actually do these things. You know what I mean? Because she has like the plot line and the story to back up why she's able to defend herself against these intruders. I mean, she grew up in the wilderness. You know what I mean? She uses that resourcefulness that she learned presumably while growing up to help her face these people. And instead of just herself, which I think is something that a lot of horror movies will go after, is like, you're on your own. She tries saving everyone in the house, even though some of those people are legitimately the ones trying to kill her, but she still tries saving them. And I think that's such a cute, like, not cute, but such an important note, is that she's still caring despite her life being on the line. And then, like, by challenging the final girl trope and showcasing more, like, nuanced female characters, I think filmmakers can shape cultural, like, attitudes, because they celebrate a broader range of femininity, embracing, like, strength and vulnerability that can empower women and also incorporate more voices into the genre. And so now I want to kind of talk about what I did as, like, my survey. So I decided to do a survey for all the people that I knew that really, really love horror movies. These were men and women. All of them I am going to remain anonymous, but I want to just read off what they said and the questions I asked. So for their age, I wanted to ask this because I wanted to make sure, I wanted to see how this opinion was different from the age groups, right? And so I had a couple people who were in their 25 to 34 range. And then the majority of everyone was from 18 to 24, which makes sense. That's my age range. And then I had a couple people who were under 18. Like, I think someone was 15, right? The thing is, gender-wise, I tried to get male people to do this form. and nobody wanted to. They had really no opinions on it. They thought I was kind of just putting an issue that didn't exist out. So everyone was female. And then I asked if they knew what the final girl trope was, because I thought that this was important. And mind you, these are all horror fans, and people who have continuously watched horror movies throughout their life. So it was pretty mixed on this one. I had a lot of no's, I had a lot of yeses, and then a couple somewhats. And then I put on a scale of 1 to 10, how often do you watch horror movies? This was something that I could use just as a range of how into something are you. So I had a couple of 10s and then a couple of like mid-ranges. And then I asked, what are your thoughts on the final girl trope in horror films? How do you think it shapes the portrayal of women? And then I had a couple people who were like, doesn't matter. But I had a couple that I think really, spoke really well. And that I'll quote this directly. They said, TBH, I've never heard of this trope till now, but I think to me personally, it can be a good and a bad thing. Depending on the ending of the movie, I think that that it depends on the portrayal of whether the women, portrayal of women, whether it is a good girl that survives or the rebellious one. I personally don't think much of it. Maybe that shapes the portrayal of women since it's just a norm that got fixated into society. I think that this portrayal of women shows how women can be the last person standing, the skill they used, or the techniques help them be the ones on top. So I got pretty differing opinions on this one. And then I wanted to ask, I had one that said, I think that the final girl trope in horror films is sexist and helps solidify the stereotypes against women. I then wanted to ask, if they had any examples of females that broke away from this stereotype. And I got, can you describe a horror movie where you felt the female lead broke away from traditional stereotypes, made her stand out? And I got Sydney from Scream, which I thought was really interesting because that was one of them that I thought was the complete opposite. I thought she gave in to almost every stereotype, at least in the first movie. I'll explain what they said, and then I'll explain my opinion on it. They said, Sydney from Scream definitely stood out. She was portrayed as a strong woman despite all the trauma she went through and didn't make dumb decisions. This may have to do with Scream in general trying to break away from horror tropes and constantly calling out loopholes in movies. So, I agree with majority of what they say. But with Sidney Prescott in Scream, I think she's probably one of the prime examples of what a sexist final girl portrayal is. Mainly because one of the biggest plots of Scream in the first movie was how Billy and her would not have sex. And she wanted to save herself, and she just wasn't ready. And that's completely fine. Completely. I love Sydney as a character. But I think that is something that is interesting to me. Because it once again brings up the aspect that she is a virgin and she doesn't feel comfortable being sexualized. While her friend, I believe her name's Tatum, the blonde girl, right? Stu's girlfriend, right? She is very promiscuous. She's dating a lot. She is, her and Stu have had sex, things like that. And she dies a horrific death. In a garage. So I think that that's such an interesting point to bring up in the different perspectives. I also want to bring up that, I forget her name, but Drew Barrymore's character in the very beginning of the film, she also gets murdered, and given she did cheat, I understand that, I'm aware, but I also think that that's something to bring up because, again, promiscuity. She is promiscuous in her activities, and she gets murdered, while Sydney is not. So I think that's something to bring up. And then someone else put in The Conjuring, the wife is very active in a fight, which is different because typically the man is saving the day. I really love the Conjuring series, probably one of my favorite films I've ever watched. They're so fun. I love them so much. But I personally agree with this one. I mean, the wife goes against it. She's a wife, a mother, all these things. She's older. and she's the one that's running into the house to save this family and things like that. And I think that that's super important, because the husband is kind of just there, and he's like, yeah, let me grab my Bible. And she's the one that's actually doing the heavy lifting. And given, I think they're both really good characters, but it begs the question of, is she the one putting in the most work here? Probably. And then I have someone who said in in Terrifier 2, I have not seen this movie, so I'm just going to go off of what this person has said. Sienna, a main girl in the movie, defended herself and her brother and fought for her life. Usually they just run away and leave the others for dead, but she stood up for herself and tried her best to save her friend, who ended up dying. She stood her ground and was not messing around when it came to defending her brother, and lived longer even when badly injured. I think that's a good point, too, because a lot of the time, final girls are not typically the ones saving their friends. It's usually their friends sacrificing themselves in exchange for this one girl living. Next one I have is, in the movie The Babadook, the female lead, Amelia, breaks away from traditional stereotypes by being a single mother. She stands out because she isn't portrayed as an innocent and virgin, and she's still tough. I think that sums up what I was trying to say. And then I wanted to ask these individuals, in their opinion, what traits should a strong female character in a horror movie embody, and why? And I got some really interesting responses that I really agree with. Someone put, some traits would be more bravery and more integrity. Sometimes it's just sad to see what they could have had more potential and more plot to the story if they had stood up or even done something, rather than just cower in fear or let someone else deal with it. It would really make them more interesting. They should embody independence, because women are often seen as having to depend on others more than often that person is a male. She should be courageous, bold, and fearless. I think they should be able to not depend on others. Asking for help is one thing, but genuinely relying on others to solve problems doesn't set a good example for the female audience. And then I wanted to ask, how do you feel about the idea that female characters often have to sacrifice their femininity to be seen as strong? And this, I got some interesting responses. I don't think it sets a good example, considering we're strong because of our feminism. Everything we've experienced as a woman has helped us shape who we are, how we act, and how to sense danger. And that was one thing that I really wanted to mention when recording this video, is that it's so true. Okay? There's countless times I have walked down the street and I immediately feel in the pit of my stomach something's wrong. And so I just, cross the street, you know what I mean? Just because, and it's not because this person specifically did anything. It's just because I feel unsafe and I don't feel comfortable. And that's completely fine. I'm valid to have those feelings. But I also think that it's so true, because everything we have experienced as women has shaped how we act, who we are, and everything else in our life. That's also a point I wanted to bring up, was the fact that in horror movies, typically when you have the final girl who is a virgin, doesn't really go out much, doesn't really know much in terms of street smarts and things like that, or, how to protect herself, I think it's really interesting that she's the last one to live, or, is the one to survive in the end. Because realistically, in my eyes at least, a girl who has gone out and lived and, has had boyfriends and has been in those situations of potentially domestic violence, things like that, would be able to spot it easier. She would be able, I feel like, to defend herself better, because I think there's a point in time where all women have had that feeling, and it depends on what you do with that feeling. And so I think that these women who are promiscuous, or, are usually the first one to die, usually the final girl's best friend, typically, I think those people are the ones that, in my eyes, would survive the longest, just because they understand what's going on in the world and they realize what they have to do to survive. Whereas typically the final girl, she knows what happens, but she doesn't really know that much. You know what I mean? And then someone else put, I feel like the idea of female characters having to sacrifice their femininity to be seen as strong is sexist. It tells the audience that a woman cannot be seen as strong because she is a woman. That in order to be seen as strong, she has to appear manly or act in a manly manner. And then almost lastly, I wanted to ask what changes would they like to see in representation of women in horror films? Someone put, I think I would love to see better representation of the constant fear women that comes with simply being a woman. I apologize. In movies, women most of the time have complete trust in men and rarely question them. I think that's why I love Sydney from Scream, because she didn't end up being skeptical of Billy, and she ended up listening to her head. More women actually fighting and throwing hands instead of just standing around as if they were some side characters. I also hate the fact that when they do stand up for themselves, they usually end up dying or getting killed in the movies after making a huge growth in their character development. I agree with that. And then I put, how do you think horror movies can better reflect the complexities of, my apologies, I have to scroll, of real women's experiences? And some people put, I think by having more female diversity working behind the cameras. What better way to reflect the complexity of women experiences than having a woman write screenplays, characters, and incorporating fear through directing? Horror movies can better reflect the complexity of real women experiences by focusing on more authentic, diverse female characters and their unique fears, struggles, and strengths. Instead of relying on stereotypes or victim roles, films could explore real-life issues like societal pressures, trauma, motherhood, or personal empowerment, showing women as fully developed, complex individuals who face challenges beyond just physical danger. And then I wanted to ask if they could think of a horror movie that successfully challenges traditional gender roles and what elements contributed to this. Again, I got actually a couple responses from this one. The Babadook. I have 2 responses from it. And then they say, the Babadook challenges traditional gender roles by centering a single mother, Amelia, who grapples with the emotional weight of grief, motherhood, and mental health. And instead of being passive victim, she confronts both her inner demons and the external manifestation of her fears, portraying strength and vulnerability. And then someone else put, some elements contributed to this are having a complex female antagonist, exploring a mother's fears, symbolism, lack of male authority, etc. And then I wanted to ask, why do you think the final girl trope remains popular in horror cinema? What does this say about audience expectations? I think someone had mentioned, I apologize, my Wi-Fi just went out. Oh, okay. 1 second here. I'll just do my makeup while we wait for that to go back on. How's your day going? I have work tonight. I'm excited. No, I'm not. We released a new cocktail at work. I'm hoping to get a mocktail version of it. It's called the Coraline. It's a blackberry rum drink, I think. Okay, I just dropped that. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. Okay, perfect. Let me pick that up and we'll continue talking. Someone put, I think it remains popular because it tries to attract the male audience. Oftentimes, the trope is sexualized. Unfortunately, example, what's the point of still watching if the hot female lead got killed off? This says a lot about audience expectations, since movies are more worried about making profit than authentically portraying the female experience. Someone else put, I think the final girl trope remains popular in horror cinema because it shows resilience and survival, which allows audiences to root for a character who confronts and overcomes terrifying challenges. This reflects audience expectations, where the female protagonist ultimately has triumphs that symbolize a form of empowerment through all the chaos. And then my last question that I wanted to ask was, what role do you believe filmmakers should play in redefining female characters in horror movies? And a lot of them, almost all the responses mention listening to women. I have listening to women, make them more independent, showing a diversity of authentic portrayals. Filmmakers should take responsibility by creating more multi-dimensional female characters in horror beyond stereotypes of victims or survivors, by exploring real world fears and empower female perspectives. Someone put that I think they should just make female characters more sarcastic because they think it's funny and accurate. I think they should study their female audience in order to redefine female characters in horror movies. So in conclusion, I'm joking, I swear. But I think that pretty much sums up what I'm trying to say as, you know, women are not the victims. And we shouldn't always be portrayed as one. Especially when a lot of the horror fans these days are women. Typically when you think about true crime, who is the people consuming that the most? And that is middle-aged white women, okay? As someone who consumes true crime, okay? I think that is just something to mention, as the fact of women are interested in these things, but I think that women just constantly being portrayed as these sex symbols in media isn't helping them want to, you know, watch these movies. You know, there are times where it could be accurate. For instance, Silence of the Lambs, when Clarice goes to the mental institution where Hannibal is, and that whole basement scene where she goes to talk to him, and all of these, you know, fellow patients, I should say, are catcalling her and, you know, being pretty explicit. I think that's something that is accurate, and it doesn't take away from her strength or empowerment. And it provides a good perspective of what, you know, Hannibal's, you know, institution looks like. And it's also, I feel, it could be determined as pretty accurate depending on which situation you're looking at it from. So I think that's just something I want to conclude with. I hope you have a great day. I need to finish my makeup. So have a great day. Bye-bye.